Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 314, Leonard Cohen and Other Rabbis. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are going to be talking with Harry Freedman, the author of a new book on the songs and poetry of Leonard Cohen, and specifically the roots of Leonard Cohen's songs in Jewish sources and Jewish traditions. Before we get into that interview, just a word about the Yeshiva, our Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. We are offering 4 courses this semester, 4 full semester courses. They go for 12 weeks, taught by Lex, me, and our dear friends Tova Birnbaum and Kashira Halev Fife. If you're interested in learning more about those classes, you can listen to last week's episode of Judaism Unbound. You can also head over to the Yeshiva website at Yeshiva, that's UNYESHIVA.com, or just go to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. And if you're listening to this podcast the weekend that it comes out, now is your time. The deadline is approaching. The classes start next week, and so you should sign up now or in the next day or two if you are hearing this episode the weekend that it comes out. If you're hearing it after the weekend that it comes out, you should sign up for next semester's Yeshiva classes. I do want to mention that there is a sliding scale tuition so that you can pay what you can afford within that scale. And if that sticker price, such as it is still too much for you to afford, there is a way to request additional financial aid. And thanks to some financial support that we've received, we're able to offer that financial aid. So don't be shy. Please request the aid that you need in order to take Yeshiva classes. We don't want cost to be an obstacle. So now let's turn to our subject for today. And I should note that we're going to be releasing a bonus episode in a couple of weeks in which I interview today's guest, Harry Freedman, at length, specifically about Leonard Cohen and his music and his ideas, and we go into much more granular detail than we are going to on this episode. We think you're going to find that conversation interesting as well. And like I said, that bonus episode will be available in a couple of weeks. Our guest today, Harry Freedman, is the author of the new book, Leonard Cohen, The Mystical Roots of Genius. The book is not a biography of Leonard Cohen. Instead, Harry Freedman looks at many of his songs and explores how Leonard Cohen reworked myths and prayers, legends and allegories from Judaism, Christianity, and other sources. Our guest today, Harry Freedman, is Britain's leading author of popular works of Jewish culture and history. His other publications include The Talmud, a biography, Kabbalah, Secrecy, Scandal, and the Soul, and The Murderous History of Bible Translations. His most recent book before the Leonard Cohen book is called Reason to Believe, The Controversial Life of Rabbi Louis Jacobs. He has created popular introductions and more than introductions, explorations of some of the most significant texts and topics in the Jewish tradition. And in doing so, he's made them accessible to those of us who are not professional scholars or who don't have a lot of history studying these topics. Harry Freedman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you, and it's particularly thrilling to talk about this topic with you.
Hi there, Dan. I'm delighted to be with you. So pleased to be talking to you.
So I'm curious about the project of writing about Leonard Cohen on 2 dimensions. One, I'm curious about what led you to write about Leonard Cohen. What were you thinking about in the process of writing, and why did you choose this project? But then I'm also interested whether you have had reactions since you put out the book that may have surprised you, that may have been confirming of things that you thought. I'm thinking about the role that Leonard Cohen seems to play in the imagination of contemporary Jews, including this contemporary Jew for whom Leonard Cohen may be the closest thing I have to a rabbi or a prophet. I'm wondering whether that is common, and if so, why or how people think about the seemingly unique role of Leonard Cohen as someone who's both a contemporary rock or folk singer, but also something deeper than that for many Jews.
To start with your second question, there's no doubt that most Jews, certainly of a certain age, and I must qualify that because I've met a lot of young Jews recently who say, who? So it's really not.
No, millennials, Gen Z, let's get our act together.
Really. There are a lot of young Jews who just have no idea who I'm talking about at all. So let's talk about people, I don't know, over the age of 35, maybe 40, I don't know. But certainly of a certain age. Leonard Cohen is, what is he? He's not, you, Dan, said he's a rabbi to you. I don't think he's a rabbi to most people. He is certainly a role model of some sort. Is it because they're proud of him because Jews tend to be proud of famous people who are Jewish? Or is there more in what he says which makes them think this guy's got something to tell me? I can't really answer that. What I do know is when I started to write the book, because really it was just a complete accident, I was listening to Hallelujah. I said this in the introduction to the book. I was listening to Hallelujah, and I heard him sing. I heard there was a secret chord which David played, which pleased the Lord. And I thought, I was just for the first time I was listening to the words rather than just listening to the music. I thought, I know what this guy's singing about. So I listened a bit more, and I realized that the whole song is based on biblical stories and a little bit of Talmud as well. So I realized that this is a guy who's worth looking at more, because what I've done all the way through my career is to try and write about Jewish things for audiences who are not necessarily immersed in Judaism. A lot of my audience are people who just are interested in Judaism in the same way as they might be interested in football or anything else. So I listened to this song and I realized that there's something going on here. But I don't think that most Jewish people, when they listen to Leonard Cohen, are necessarily listening to his biblical or Talmudic or Kabbalistic words. I think they might have a sense they're there. They're not listening to them in the same way as I was trying to put them across in the book. I was trying to explain what he's doing in the book, which is unique, which is based on Jewish sources, where those sources come from, why he might have used them. I don't think most people think of him in that sense, but they do think of him in the sense of him being a Jewish character who is important to them in some way. If you ask them, for example, is Leonard Cohen more important to you than Bob Dylan? I think probably the answer is not from a Jewish point of view. I don't think many people would say, yes, Leonard Cohen is far more Jewish than Bob Dylan. They might do once they read my book or once they stop to think about it. I don't think off the top of their head they would simply say, yes, he's more Jewish than Bob Dylan. I think they may say he is more respected as a Jew than some other people, but I don't think they would say he's more Jewish than Bob Dylan. These are both successful Jewish artists who Jews are often proud of simply because they're Jewish, because they've shown that Jews can interact in the world, in the secular world, not just in business and the things that we know we're good at, but in entertainment as well.
Once you look at some of the Jewish sources, like in your book, and you understand how deeply immersed he was and how a lot of his work is coming out of that engagement with Jewish sources, it doesn't strike me that there are so many people who end up doing what he's doing, and that's in two different ways. One, there's people who are so immersed in the Jewish sources, and they end up becoming some kind of artist that's very narrowly Jewish. Like they write songs that are, sung only in synagogues, and maybe their melodies or their new ideas. And then there are people like, maybe Paul Simon and maybe Dylan is a little more like, for example, in Highway 61 Revisited, he'll take on a Jewish text with more depth. But mostly you say, well, these are people who they were Jewish and it mattered that they were Jewish and that their music comes out of a Jewish sensibility. But the content itself is not that often engaged in the sources, whereas Leonard Cohen feels like he's doing something almost unique where he's immersed in the sources, but he's crunching them up, he's mixing them together with other sources, and he's coming out with something profoundly new that feels actually like in some ways exactly what I wish was going on so much more in the Jewish world, which is that there would be more Jewish art that was actually moving things forward and that was making new things out of the old Jewish stuff, and that feels rare to me.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think from that perspective, Leonard Cohen is quite unique because he is the one who is using Jewish sources and building them into his work and showing how you can create stories and ideas and philosophies using Jewish stories Jewish sources in a contemporary context. I think what I was saying in my previous answer was that I don't think most people recognize that about him unless they stop to think about it. It doesn't hit you between the eyes. In other words, his use of Jewish sources, and this is, one of his great strengths. His use of Jewish sources is in no way evangelical or in any way trying to get people to think, oh, yes, here's a Jewish source, I must understand what this is about. He is simply, this is just his vocabulary. It's just the way he's talking. And I didn't meet Leonard Cohen. It may well be that he spoke in real life when he was talking to a friend in the same way. I don't know. Jewish sources are his vocabulary, but he is unique in that. I don't know of anybody else who uses Jewish sources in the same way, and not just in music, in literature, in art. In art, obviously, yes, of course, there's a huge tradition, particularly in Christian art, of biblical images. But I don't know anybody from a Jewish perspective who does that.
I think in Israeli music we can find it, but not so much in
Israeli
America.
music, maybe, yes, but in Israeli music they're using it because it's cultural, because it's just part of the part of the way they think and engage with each other. Whereas Leonard Cohen he's not doing this because he grew up in a deeply religious background where everybody was talking about religious sources all the time. He did grow up in a religious home, but it was a westernized home. It was a Canadian home, and his family were very much trying to settle down and settling down as English-speaking Canadian citizens. They weren't out there trying to be, as some families are in the West these days, just exclusively Jewish with no mind to what's going on around them.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, in our show notes on this episode for listeners, I'm gonna put a couple references. I agree with you that it's really rare, and I can't think of many examples like this among musicians. I am gonna put in our show notes a link to Ezra Furman's episode with us. She expressed that she sort of is a follower of Leonard Cohen, and I think in certain ways is a current musician that's doing some of this. But I want to ask a different question, or start with a comment. I'll get to a question. Comment. I am teaching a course this semester in our Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. It's called This Too is Torah. And when I talk about it to people, I tend to describe it as we look at different realms of human experience, film, music, food, as sacred, as forms of Torah, even as
right.
Like really important, basically.
Yeah.
And sometimes when people don't get it, I'll start by saying, how Leonard Cohen is sometimes used in synagogue liturgy, and people can relate to Leonard Cohen as more than just a musician. Picture that, but for all sorts of other stuff. Leonard Cohen is the gateway drug
right.
to a lot of this thinking that I believe is very important. Yeah. And I think the reasons for that are what you've talked about so far, right? That it's so clear that there's a depth of knowledge Jewishly, and there's also real seeds of his own creativity in it. And I think that, you use the word genius in the title of your book
yes.
for a reason. But I guess I'm curious, to think about two different ways people deploy Leonard Cohen. Because at this point, sad to say, we don't have Leonard Cohen as primary voice. Yeah. We have him as quoted voice by others. The metaphor I'd give is Leonard Cohen as the center of the page. So picture a prayer book. So I'm picturing if we're reading a prayer book for Rosh Hashanah, and we're talking about who by fire, who by water, right? You could place Leonard Cohen in the center of the page for that prayer that he's sort of giving a commentary on or a new take on. And if you place it in the center of the page, you're kind of saying this is our synagogue's experience of who by fire. You could also put it in the margins of the page. Yes. As a commentary on, I'm going to say in quotes, the real thing, the traditional text of Who by Fire, Unatana Tokef, and you could see it as a commentary. Yeah. And I'm curious, not so much how you experience Leonard Cohen, but how you'd sort of analyze what's happening there. Why is it that people are deploying Leonard Cohen in those two different ways, and how might they differ from one another?
The illustration you gave just now is interesting because the reform movement in Britain, where I live, in the United Kingdom, the reform movement brought out a Rosh Hashanah Machzah not so long ago, and they did exactly what you just described. They had the traditional words for Unatani Tokef, what Leonard Cohen calls Who by Fire, in the center of the page, and his lyrics underneath. So that's, in a sense, he was the commentary on the initial prayer. I think that if you're going to put Leonard Cohen in the center of the page, and you're then going to be looking at other artists or creatives in a wider sense, I'm struggling to know who you would have round him. Who would be the commentaries on Leonard Cohen?
To clarify a little bit, part of what I'm getting at is if Leonard Cohen were the center of the page and the traditional text, like the Unetane Tokef text, were the margin. I'm actually getting at that kind of inversion.
Right. There are certain Leonard Cohen songs, Who by Fire is one of them, Hallelujah is another one. Maybe You Want It Dark, although it's a bit too soon to know. There are certain songs which are being sung in synagogues, which are finding their way into prayer books, which I ask the question really in my book, will these songs still be there in 200 or 300 years' time? We have a tradition in Judaism of people writing synagogue music, and it goes back to the 7th or 8th century. We have a tradition of people writing synagogue music, which then stays in our liturgy. And some of those, for example, Unetane Tokef is one of them. The legend, there's a legend about it. It comes from the 11th century. There's a much earlier version of it, which comes from, we don't know when, 3rd or 4th century. Jewish liturgy is built up in layers, written by people over centuries. And the question that I'm asking at the end of my book is, will Leonard Cohen be one of those layers? In other words, if we come back in 500 years' time or even 200 years' time, will people still be singing Who by Fire or Hallelujah in the same way that they're singing the ancient versions today? If the answer is no to that, then I suspect the answer is only no because of our zeitgeist, because of where we are now. We live in a world where things change so fast that whereas 1,000 years ago, if you wrote a poem, it would be remembered, today it might not be. But I think that Leonard Cohen has the same quality, the same essence that people like Kalir, who was one of the earliest of these poets, has. The ability to take Bible stories and Jewish folklore, Midrash, Jewish folklore, to take those things and to weave them into new messages and new songs and new ideas and to create new images, verbal images with them. The difference between Kalir and Leonard Cohen was that Kalir was doing it for the synagogue, whereas Leonard Cohen was doing it for himself and for his audience. But nevertheless, it is finding its way into the synagogue.
I now have 3 relevant playlists on my phone for this. One, I have one that pre-existed your book, which I call Leonard Cohen Prayers. And it was all the Leonard Cohen songs that I had identified that I experience as prayers, that I think he intended as prayers, that I when I listen to them, I feel elevated in some spiritual way. And that is a much more significant prayer book in my life than the Siddur is. It functions for me as I imagine the Siddur is supposed to function for people for whom it functions, which is that it actually makes me feel something when I listen to it, and I will listen to it at a certain time of need, and it really functions that way. I also made a playlist when I was reading your book, which I haven't, sort of really listened to over and over and over again yet, but I was interested in sort of making a playlist of the songs that you identified as the ones that were most drawing on Jewish sources, and I'm kind of sitting with that. And then we actually have another playlist that we created a few years ago, which was an attempt to put together in a new way the High Holiday liturgy using a variety of songs, contemporary songs by all kinds of artists. And for example, what I call the Torah reading part of it, which is about the binding of Isaac on Rosh Hashanah. That's the Torah reading that we have. So we have Leonard Cohen's Story of Isaac. We have Highway 61 revisited by Bob Dylan, but we also have songs about difficult relationships between fathers and sons, not intended to be written sort of from a Jewish perspective or for a Jewish liturgical use, whereas with Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, they probably didn't intend it for Jewish liturgical use, but they were consciously drawing on that particular text. And I think it's interesting to sort of think about both in terms of the present, but also the past. Is it the case that all the material that we now use for Jewish purposes, and I don't only mean liturgical purposes like in the Siddur, but you've also written about the Talmud and about Kabbalah. I'm wondering whether in other parts of the Jewish tradition and textual tradition, there are things that were not at all constructed for the purpose of being used religiously by Judaism, but then one way or another, they became incorporated into the mix. And how did that go about? And was it controversial at the time, et cetera?
Well, I think that absolutely you're right there. And I think the most obvious example of that is Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, which is a beautiful erotic poem, which has found its way into the Bible. I mean, clearly nobody ever sat down to write a Bible, but when Isaiah wrote his book, or when the Book of Kings was written, they knew they were writing Jewish religious history. When whoever wrote Song of Songs, in the tradition it's King Solomon, but let's assume it wasn't, it probably wasn't. Whoever wrote the Song of Songs, did they think they were writing a religious song? Did they think they were writing a song which we, rabbinically, we interpret as a song about the love between God and Israel? Well, thanks, but was that really what was going through the mind of the person who wrote it? So I think, yes, I think the answer is there is stuff which has come from outside, which we have adopted. And another great one is the story of the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther, whose heroes are Mordecai and Esther, whose names are very similar to the Babylonian gods Marduk and Astarte. We have taken what seems to be a Babylonian or an Iranian or some folklore from elsewhere, and we take it into the Bible. So yes, there is no question that we have in our most sacred texts, and certainly in our less sacred texts as well. In other words, in rabbinic response through the centuries or whatever, we have influences coming from everywhere. Maimonides, who's influenced by Aristotle. So yes, these things do come in. I don't think it's beyond our imagination, particularly since we live in such a diverse Jewish world now, where there are so many different streams of Judaism, to see that not just Leonard Cohen's music, but all sorts of other Jewish works which are coming from outside, maybe even Jewish film, who knows, which would one day be part of our, or maybe even already are part of our liturgy.
Yeah. So you said very quickly, and I want to really sit with what you said, Song of Songs, probably not written by Solomon. Strong agree. Our podcast strongly agrees with that statement. And honestly, I think most of our listeners not only won't have a problem with that statement, but will co-sign. But I want to name it because that's, of course, not everybody's approach. And for many people, it's, of religious importance that a particular person, Solomon, wrote Song of Songs and, some of the other biblical books at a specific time in history. And the fact that that's true is important. And if it weren't true, all sorts of questions would come up. And but I want to bring that up because it segues us into another topic that you've delved deeply into, which is a person that I don't believe we've talked about on this podcast, but it's a person named Louis Jacobs. And he's somebody who a lot of his life revolved around this question of what has often been framed as sort of opposites, right? The classic approach to traditional text being true and from God, Bible being from God and divine, versus, biblical criticism, the idea that humans wrote the Bible, that somebody, I guess Solomon, if you think Solomon wrote that part, you're not saying that a human didn't write the Bible, but you are saying a specific human did. And so I was curious to start going into that direction and see where it might lead us. Who was Louis Jacobs? And for those of us interested in questions of biblical interpretation, why might he matter to us?
Louis Jacobs was a very controversial figure in British Jewry. He wouldn't have been controversial in the States. I think it's really important to say at this point. He wouldn't have been controversial in the States because his Judaism really was not that different from the old conservative movement in the States. But in British Orthodoxy, where he was an Orthodox rabbi, he raised the question of who wrote the Torah, or at least not so much who wrote it, but do we accept that the Torah is given on Mount Sinai, word for word, to Moses, who then transcribes it and gives it to the nation, the Israelite nation, and it's handed then down through the centuries. And his view very much was that we have to accept the findings of science, we have to accept the findings of rationalism, and if literary study of the Torah texts suggests there is more than one author, it shouldn't challenge our religious belief to say this work is divine, but it may not have been dictated literally on Mount Sinai. It may simply have been written under inspiration by different authors over a period of time. That is a perfectly straightforward piece of theology from the conservative and the reform movements. But in Orthodoxy, and certainly in British Orthodoxy at the time when Louis Jacobs was writing, when we talk about the 1950s, 1960s, it was heresy. He always regarded himself as an Orthodox rabbi. This is a very important part of his worldview. Orthodoxy to him had to be capable of dealing with science, of dealing with the challenges of rationalism. one of his mantras was, it's not what Maimonides said then, it's what Maimonides would have said today. Because clearly there are many things in Maimonides' writing which we are uncomfortable with today, but he was at the same time a strong rationalist. And for him, the great tragedy of orthodoxy was that it was becoming dogmatic rather than becoming open-minded. And he took this attitude also into halacha as well. Again, it's not, I don't think it would be a surprise to conservative Jews in America, but he showed how Orthodox halacha had evolved over the centuries, that when a rabbi gave a rabbinic ruling, although he based it on his sources, he knew where he wanted to get to before he started, and he found the sources which were relevant. So if we take that back to the idea of King Solomon writing the Song of Songs, yes, the tradition says that King Solomon wrote the Song of Songs, but it doesn't say it in as dogmatic a way as it says that Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai and handed the oral Torah to Joshua and handed the physical place of physical the Ten Commandments in the Ark in the Mishkan. It doesn't do that. I don't think it would necessarily challenge their faith to be told that this book wasn't written by Solomon, or to have the suggestion put in front of them the book wasn't written by Solomon. But so we started this point on Louis Jacobs, and I think I just want to sort of finish with Louis Jacobs, because one of almost the great tragedies of his life was that he became defined by this question of who wrote the Torah and biblical criticism. In a sense, he did it to himself, because he spoke about it in his sermons almost every week. But his literary oeuvre, he wrote something like 60 books. And as a Jewish teacher and as a Jewish writer, he's up there with the greats of our age. And it's a shame that people see him, particularly in Orthodox, where they see him as a heretic. He believed that God gave us a brain and we should use it.
I wanted to kind of make a connection and a compare and contrast with Louis Jacobs and Leonard Cohen in a certain way, which is, I'm thinking about, there's something going on right now these days. I'm not sure if you're aware of it at all, but there is a woman who has been doing these short videos on TikTok that are reacting to the daily Talmud page, Daf Yomi.
I heard about it the other day. My brother was going to send me one. He never did, so I still haven't seen one.
I'll send them to you after the recording. So different people that Lex and I know, have different opinions, but they're only about how insightful it is. I think it's really great. I watch it every day. Other people maybe a little less. But nobody in our world is saying, how dare she do this? But It seems that in the Orthodox world, and some of this is getting reflected in some podcasts that I've listened to that kind of are people connected to that world, a lot of the reaction is saying, well, I think what she's doing is really good, but everybody I know thinks it's terrible and nobody should be doing it like that. And so the debate becomes how terrible it is or how not terrible it is that she's doing, as opposed to this whole other segment of the Jewish world that isn't even asking those questions and that's actually being engaged in Talmud by what she's doing. And I'm wondering whether somebody like Leonard Cohen, who is positioned outside of the traditional Jewish infrastructure, not only gets away with it in terms of the people who are not traditional, who love what he's doing and who are connecting to Judaism through it in certain ways, but the Orthodox world seems to have very little problem with Leonard Cohen, even though his music is infused with all kinds of Christian imagery and all kinds of Buddhist imagery and all this kind of stuff. Somehow they don't find that to be problematic in the same way.
Dan,
whereas,
I'm sorry I do want to know, not to distract too much, but I think it might be relevant that Leonard Cohen is a white guy and Miriam Anzovin is a young white woman.
That's part of it. No, absolutely. I mean, I want to ask, look, there's one possibility that there's an element of misogyny going on and all that kind of thing. So Miriam Anzovin is an interesting case study, but I think Leonard Cohen versus Louis Jacobs is two white men. I mean, there's a question there about whether it's actually. And here I want to go back to some of what you discovered in your other researches about how the Talmud came to be and all kinds of things like that. Is it maybe that realistically these changes that ultimately will take root, and like you were saying, that we will be reading Leonard Cohen as prayers in hundreds of years from now, but the only way that that's really possible is when somebody from outside the system is really doing it in a deep and substantial way, and then it can later be kind of imported as a whole, as opposed to somebody who's within the system trying to do something new, and that'll generally get them kicked out as a heretic.
Okay, so I think there are 2 points there, Dan. I think the first point is Louis Jacobs versus Leonard Cohen as to what, why one is acceptable and one isn't. Although I disagree that Leonard Cohen is acceptable to the Orthodox. I think most really Orthodox people have never even heard of Leonard Cohen, so I wouldn't necessarily go that far. but certainly they wouldn't have a problem if they listened to Leonard Cohen. The point about Louis Jacobs was that he was regarded as an Eloi, as a Talmudic genius by the Gateshead Yeshiva, which was a yeshiva established during the Second World War for serious European rabbinic scholars who managed to escape from Poland and from Germany, who were brought to England, and this was the cream of European scholarship, and Louis Jacobs was amongst them, and he was regarded as one of their geniuses, and then he effectively let them down. They saw him as the future, and he turned out to be a different future from the one they envisaged. So there's a whole area of disappointment and almost a sense of betrayal in the Orthodox world about their attitude towards Louis Jacobs, which clearly there is not for Leonard Cohen, because Leonard Cohen wasn't even a rabbi. Leonard Cohen was just a Jewish guy singing songs, and if they listen to it, they might find it amusing, interesting, whatever. It didn't have to challenge their faith. So I don't think you can draw a comparison there. I think what is interesting though is that Louis Jacobs obviously lived in England, but he toured the States a few times, and he went to Canada once, and he spoke at the Shah HaShamayim synagogue in Montreal where Leonard Cohen grew up. So there is a connection, and I've discussed it with the people at the Shah HaShamayim synagogue, and they seem to remember Louis Jacobs coming very well. The second part of your question, Dan, was really about how things come into the tradition and whether things can come in from outside. I don't think Orthodoxy would ever admit anything from outside the tradition into its liturgy. There's no question that a Leonard Cohen song might be sung in an Orthodox synagogue. Yes, you might, in a sort of more liberal-minded Orthodox synagogue, they might sing Adon Olam at the end of the service to Hallelujah. They might just do that, but they certainly wouldn't import the words of Who by Fire in place of the traditional words of Unatane Tokef. Just wouldn't happen. I think we have to differentiate and say that within the more liberal-minded, within the more progressive-minded streams, within conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, in England, liberal Judaism, within those streams, yes, it is very likely that you could bring in not just Leonard Cohen, but other people as well. Within Orthodoxy, I don't think there's ever any chance of that, because otherwise it wouldn't be Orthodoxy. It would have already given in to heretical leanings.
So I had no idea we were going to be talking about Miriam Anzovin, although I shouldn't be surprised because a lot of the conversations I'm having with anybody about anything are turning that direction. But I'm thrilled because we've got a triple threat of people I doubt have ever been considered together, which is to say Leonard Cohen, Louis Jacobs, Miriam Anzovin. Now, I want to think about them from our specific Judaism unbound, emphasis on the unbound perspective, because I think part of why they're all arising, or part of why Miriam Anzovin arises after the first two, is that each of them are what I would term straddlers of boundaries. They push us to question certain separations or boundaries that exist in life or in Judaism. And what I mean by that is I would describe Louis Jacobs's boundary straddling as like theological. He is straddling two things that are sort of treated as mutually exclusive, but he's arguing they're not mutually exclusive, sort of a deep connection to Torah as divine and also biblical criticism and modern scholarship. That's sort of a theological boundary crossing or straddling. Leonard Cohen, I think, is taking on a sociological boundary crossing between things that we tend to think of as quote unquote religion and quote unquote culture. I think what he creates is something that is hard to place easily into one of those two boxes. And that's part of what's so fascinating about him and why he can be in a synagogue's service 1 second and then on the radio the next second. The third with Miriam Anzovin, I'm going to do another technological. Part of people's problem with Miriam Anzovin is the very fact that she is exploring Daf Yomi on TikTok, this, to sound crotchety, this newfangled gizmo on the phone. And it's also, this doesn't rhyme with the ogicals, but linguistic. She uses a lot of crass language. She uses like contemporary internet discourse in what she does in a way that people are not used to hearing around Talmud. It's another boundary. We draw, we have special words that we use in sacred context, but then we keep, swear words for internet conversations. And she's straddling that boundary. So I guess what draws you, you haven't written anything about Miriam Anzovin yet, but to the first two, what draws you to these folks that seem to be straddling various boundaries? And on a show like ours, where we're literally called Unbound, what might you say we're able to learn specifically from folks who are taking categories in our heads and saying, you know what? I kind of question those. I'm going to straddle those.
As you were talking, I'm thinking what Miriam Anzorin is doing is exactly what Louis Jacobs wanted, because you said she's on TikTok. It's not kosher. You shouldn't be talking about Daf Yomi on TikTok. But actually, 20 years ago, you shouldn't have been talking about Daf Yomi on the internet either. And yet the internet is full of Daf Yomi shiurim and Daf Yomi programs and Daf Yomi explanations and everything else like that. So all Miriam Anzorin is doing really is taking it to the next level. TikTok is the contemporary internet from 20 years ago. Now, Louis Jacobs would say, but this is how Jewish law evolves. Jewish law has always been dynamic, has always evolved, has always responded to the needs of the times, and continues to do so unless it becomes fossilized in certain aspects of orthodoxy. So I think those two people really illustrate what Judaism is all about and the opportunities which are open if we just open our minds a little bit. Now, Leonard Cohen equally fits into this conversation, not just because of what you said about culture and religion, but because so much of Leonard Cohen's music contains the word window. And the window for Leonard Cohen is a boundary. In the song, The Window, he says to a soul, he's singing to a soul, why do you stand at the window, immersed in beauty and pride? I can't remember the exact words. He's telling this soul to step through the window. The soul is hesitating before ascending into what we call a mystical union. It's quite clear that's what the song is all about, because he describes various stages of ascent of the soul in the song, but it's the window that's stopping it. The window is the boundary. So for Leonard Cohen, the window is a liminal space. And in a sense, all these three people are dealing with liminal challenges, the challenges of stepping outside boundaries into other boundaries, which is what you're doing in Judaism Unbound, of course. It's very interesting that you've called your podcast Judaism Unbound, because for many people who are not particularly keen on the fact they are Jewish, the problem with Judaism is that it binds you. You should bind them on your arms and on your head is the defining thing which an Orthodox male Jew and many other Jews do today. Constraints, limits, and yet we know from any sort of experience of history that we're not constrained, and we're quite prepared to move our boundaries as time goes by. And I think that all those three people you mentioned are good illustrations of that.
When you said earlier that Orthodoxy will not bring in Leonard Cohen songs or other things into the liturgy, because in a sense that's what defines Orthodoxy is not to do that. And I want to distinguish between Orthodoxy, as many of us think of it today, as a movement, versus Orthodoxy as just like a way of being. And because the Orthodox movement is relatively modern, it's something that arose in the last few hundred years. But the impulse to be what we think of as Orthodox, right? The impulse to resist change and to not be flexible, as you're talking about, that's been around a long time, but as has its converse, right? And what I want to kind of tease out a little bit is when we think about how you answered earlier, right, that there are so many things that didn't start off as Jewish texts that became so, like the Song of Songs, that means that somebody at some point in the past was doing something unorthodox, right, or unbound. In other words, that orthodoxy, people think of Orthodox as the way it's always been, but that's 100% wrong, that we've always had Orthodox and we've always had unorthodox, right? And that to truly understand the history of things, it's really, how would you say, a conversation, a dialectic between those two.
But of course, the word orthodox only means correct thoughts. I mean, it's Greek. But I think that also it's not just a question of orthodoxy versus non-orthodoxy. I'm not disputing the fact that the Song of Songs was written by a Jew or a Hebrew or whatever they were called in those days. I just don't think they wrote it for a religious purpose, but it was part of the cultural literature of that age. And, you know, as I said before, nobody sat down to write a Bible. the Bible was compiled, and as the Bible was compiled, it was compiled over centuries. We know this because there are discussions in the Talmud in the 4th or 5th century, maybe even 6th or 7th century, about what goes in and what doesn't go in the Bible. And we also know that there are references in the Bible itself to other books which we no longer have. So we know it's compiled over centuries, but people found works of literature and said, yes, this one's coming in, this one's not coming in. And that's how the Bible was compiled. So the Song of Songs or the Book of Esther were put in there because whoever was doing the compiling at that particular moment in Jewish history found them of some particular spiritual significance. Orthodoxy today and the sort of the closeness of orthodoxy, I think, has to be understood in terms of its reaction to first the Enlightenment and then the emergence of reform. Nobody was called Orthodox until there was reform. Once there was reform, then everybody who wasn't reformed became known as Orthodox, because what else were you going to call them? Just like the Hasidim, when the Hasidim came along, everybody who wasn't a Hasid was called a misneged, an opponent. Well, that's not a theologically defining word. That is just simply means somebody who's not a Hasid. And I think Orthodox is the same as somebody who wasn't Reformed. So Orthodoxy, yes, it has put up the shutters, it's put up the barriers. A lot of that obviously has got to do with the Shoah as well, and just a sense of fear and a sense of persecution, a sense of how are we going to survive? We're going to put up the shutters. But I think that Judaism, in its widest context, has always been open to outside thought. Otherwise, as I said before, we wouldn't have survived. And we have survived in so many different cultures that we had to absorb from all those different cultures. The Judaism that I've absorbed living in the UK is different from the Judaism you have absorbed living in the States, because the influences I've had are differences to yours. They may not be hugely different, but if you think about somebody in the Ottoman Empire versus somebody in Amsterdam 200 or 300 years ago, hugely different. The boundaries of Judaism are flexible. They may be different in different places, but yes, I think Judaism has always been unbound. It's good that you're saying it again now. Yes,
I'm glad. You're giving us a lot of good, clean quotables for why our title is what it is, Judaism Unbound. Another quotable of yours that I love is, nobody sat down and wrote a Bible, that it was compiled over centuries.
Yeah.
And that is just a perfect segue to a book of yours that we haven't spoken about yet. And I'll be direct with our listeners. I try very hard to read, usually fully, but at least in part, any books that we are talking with guests about. You've written a bunch of books that we knew might be relevant to this conversation, so I wasn't able to read all of them. I didn't get to read The Murderous History of Bible Translations, but it's an amazing title, and it gets at this question of sort of what the Bible is and isn't, and how it's been used over time. So I'd love to get a little bit of that from you before we go. Translating things is really sometimes contentious. I've made the joke that canon, C-A-N-O-N, we talk about biblical canons and other kinds of canons, that it should be spelled C-A-N-N-O-N, that it's like shots fired from a cannon. So biblical translations being murderous, or at least potentially murderous, is certainly something that makes a lot of sense to me. But what's the ikar, what's the essence of the murderous history of Bible translations, and does it tie to what we've been talking about so far?
So the intellectual essence of that, if you like, is that every translation is an interpretation. And if you allow, because you can't, and the example I always give is the French word aimer, which means to like or to love. So if I say in French, je t'aime, I can mean I love you or I like you. Now in English, those are two completely different concepts, but in French, it seems to be the same concept. I don't know, I'm not French, I don't quite understand how it works, but certainly one word has two completely different meanings in our language. So therefore, translations are always in some way interpretations, because if you're going to translate the French word aimer, how are you going to translate it as like or love? It's going to change the context of the passage. And anytime somebody translates the Bible, you are effectively threatening the status quo. You're threatening the religious authorities of the times. And this is clearly stated in the Talmud, because it says that the day that the Talmud, the day the Torah was translated into Greek, they're talking about roughly 300 BCE, and the Talmud says the day was as dark for the Jews as the day that the golden calf was made. So in other words, the rabbis did not like it, because what's happening? What's happening is that the Torah is being made available to Greek culture, and to Greeks who thought very differently from Jews. And the story of Hanukkah, for example, is a story of the ideological battle between the Greeks and the Jews, and not just in terms of a war over the temple, but in terms of the way they thought. The Greek focus on beauty and the Hebrew focus on the word. These are fundamental concepts. Translating the Torah into Greek suddenly opened up Jewish thought to alien ideas. So we see in Judaism that the translation of the Torah into Greek was a threat to the rabbis. And in Christianity, the Catholic Church preached the Bible to its worshippers in the churches, and it included concepts like hell and purgatory, which are nowhere in the Christian tradition at all, in the Christian biblical tradition. Catholicism had a big thing about purgatory and a big thing about hell, but the Christian Bible doesn't mention them, or hardly ever, maybe in the book of Revelation, but that's all. The Catholic Church was deeply threatened when in the 16th century, after the Reformation, people like Tyndale, the proto-Protestant biblical translator, starts to translate the Bible into English. It's been translated into English before, by Wycliffe in the 13th century, and he was burnt at the stake for it, I think, and certainly his bones were ground up and thrown in the river. The translation of the Bible for Christianity threatened the power of the Catholic Church. So that's basically what that book is about. Translations are dangerous things because they allow people to think for themselves, and that's not what you want if you're running a religion.
Yeah, and to make that connection back again to Miriam Anzovin, but really what she stands for is just this idea that there's something that's actually happening in our world right now that relates to all this, which is really just it's a combination of translation and the internet. And so Jewish texts are available to regular people in a way that just has never been before. And that is both very generative and very scary.
And you can see again, looking at history, you can see various levels. Before printing, manuscript texts of any sort were very, very rare. And if a community had one copy of the Talmud, they were doing well. And if you wanted to see what a certain rabbi had said about something else, you might go to a community 100 miles away to borrow a copy of his manuscript. Then printing comes along, and suddenly everything becomes standardized, and you get the Shulchan Aruch, which is the first widely disseminated Jewish code of law. And all these little villages and steebles around Europe, and probably around the Ottoman Empire as well, suddenly are being told this is how you do it. So diversity disappears, and you're starting to get a rigid structure. And now what we've got is a sort of movement away from it. We have the internet, which is, in a sense, you've got Sefaria, which is opening things up again. Suddenly, it's all becoming open. It's impossible for anybody to say this is how it's done anymore. But for a period from the beginning of the 16th century until the beginning of the internet, Judaism is becoming more and more rigidly controlled because of printing, basically, and the things that were being printed.
In terms of Sefaria, it's the coolest name for an organization because it's like a pun, and people don't realize it's a pun. I love my interlingual puns on this show. It's a play on Sifriya, which is a Hebrew word for library, but then it's blurred with safari, which is both like the idea of exploration and safari, like in English, and a literal internet browser called Safari. So that's a non-relevant thing. My question is based on the fact that as we record this, Sefaria just a couple days ago announced that they have 7 new translations of Torah that will now be available for everyone online. So in the past, when you've gone to Sefaria, they have the whole Tanakh, the whole Bible. They have all the Talmud. They have lots of Jewish texts, but you haven't always had multiple choices for which translation you go with. And as somebody who has spent time going to Torah studies, where people bring their own translations, it is truly amazing. It's not just trivial little things that change about a story or about a text when you switch the English translation. It can be the entire weight of a story. You can soften something that's really horrifying. You can make something significant that might have been a trivial phrase in other English translations. Like, you can do so much. You can leave words out that are in the Hebrew and sort of fudge it in the English. You can add words in that weren't in the Hebrew. And so I guess as a closing question, given that we now are in a world with 7 translation options on Safari that we can all explore. And given that that ties to everything you've said about Bible translation, I have a metaphorical question, which is Leonard Cohen a translation? Like, is Leonard Cohen's work a translation from Jewishness, Judaism, to extra Jewish stuff? Is it the other way? Is it a translation of our contemporary society into Judaism? How might we think about translation as applied to Leonard Cohen's work? How might it tie to the fact that we can access different literal translations of Jewish work today?
In terms of Leonard Cohen, yes, absolutely, he is a translation. Absolutely. Because first of all, he's singing it in English. Secondly, he's not singing the actual biblical quote. He's not singing the actual Talmudic legend. He's already singing his version of it. He sings, "You saw her bathing from, your faith was strong, you needed proof, you saw her bathing from the roof." Well, that's not the biblical quote. The biblical quote is more complicated than that. He's condensed that whole, the two things, the Talmudic legend and the biblical story, into 2 lines of a poem. So yes, he's a translation. He's a translation who, if you listen to him, it works for us. But like all translations, it's a midrash. Apart from the translations which are the peshat, which are the plain meaning, it's a midrash. It's a way of interpreting the text. So yes, absolutely, Leonard Cohen is a translation, but there's nothing wrong with that. That is a good thing.
An amazing note for us to close on. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to remind you that our Yeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, is launching our spring 2022 courses this coming week as we release this episode. And if you're listening in the first couple days of this episode, you can still sign up for courses. Just go to judaismunbound.com/classes and check out our 4 courses. We encourage you to sign up and journey with us into the first steps of the Yeshiva. So we also want to close this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.